Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue on with our examination, our look at the career and the accomplishments of Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. Now in our last lecture we wrapped up our discussion or our overview of Islamic civilization, of the accomplishments of the Abbasid caliphs, of the great accomplishments of the scholars, of the Islamic scholars who, among other things, integrated or synthesized the knowledge of the past along with the new advancement that they themselves were making. We saw the integration of Indian numerals and the concept of zero, along with the new integrated mathematical operations that became known as algebra, or just simply algebra. We saw the synthesis of all the medical learning, all of the medical texts and the medical innovations and doctrines into the canon of medicine. And also we saw the great advancements in alchemy and the rise of chemical laboratories that led to the distillation of pure alcohol, led to great advancements in the understanding of evaporation and crystallization. And from there, we jumped to the Franks. We looked at the rise of the Carolingian Dynasty. We saw how Pepin the Short displaced the last of the Merovingian kings, and we began our examination into Charlemagne, primarily by looking at the fact that we don't really have greater sources that we hope we would have for someone like him. Our best source, a source from a man named Einhard, is a good starting point, but it's also filled with some propagandic tales that are designed to present the best possible image of Charlemagne instead of a true and historically accurate description of Charlemagne. Now, of Charlemagne's personal traits, we know that the Pope tried to get Charlemagne to dress up and to look more regal at important events, and that Charlemagne hated it. He really did just like to dress down and wear traditional Frankish clothing, which of course on the international scene did not really leave those who came into contact with Charlemagne with the importance or the grandeur of his Frankish possessions. We know that Charlemagne liked to swim, that it was one of his and his family's favorite hobbies. We knew that he liked to bathe, and bathing was done in a very public setting. This would be some friends, some courtiers of his, and they would engage in public baths on the scale of the Roman patricians, of the Roman elites. But we also know that he had a working bath for his own personal use, and that it was equipped with hot water. Hot baths was a real treasured activity of his. And also, as stated last time, because of his high-pitched voice, he hated singing in public. We also know that Charlemagne was a very devout individual. He loved listening to the chanting of monks or even just hearing monks pray. He was also very selective in his religious practices. He hated to fast. He did not abstain from eating meat, which was his favorite part of any course. Einhard also goes on to exaggerate Charlemagne's intellectual achievements. He tells us that Charlemagne was well versed in Latin and competent in Greek. He tells us that Charlemagne's favorite book was City of God by Augustine. Now, Einhard claims have come to be eyed very carefully because he also tells us that Charlemagne could not write his own name, and that he kept a wax tablet underneath his pillow with a stylus, and that he would simply practice spelling out his own name, Carolus, which he was still incapable of doing after years and years of practice. Another biography about Charlemagne was written by a monk, and this monk tells by a separate monk, and this one is a really just a contradiction of some of the things that Einhard tells us. This monk tells us that Charlemagne interrupted the chanting of the monks. He would interrupt them in the middle of a sentence or a word where it made no sense to stop, and order the monks to start chanting. To start chanting something else. And this suggests to us that his knowledge of Latin was not as proficient as Einhard would have us believe. Einhard tells us that Charlemagne was a family man. Having married many times, he was something of a Lothario. He kept a number of concubines. And we do know that Charlemagne was devoted to his children. He had extremely good relations with his heir, Louis the Pious, but he kept a very tight rein over his daughters, refusing to allow them to marry. And he was famed for taking them on his travels. Now, Einhard reports that this is because the king was so attached to his children that he could not bear to be parted from them. There's another reason for this, and the reason was to preserve the Carolingian control over the Franks, to eliminate the prospect of a son-in-law trying to usurp either Charlemagne's place or his dynastic male line successor's place. Now, when Pepin the Short, the father of Charlemagne, died, he left behind two legitimate sons, Charles, the future Charlemagne, and Carloman. Now, the brothers had many differences, but they were united in one thing: their opposition to Grifo, an illegitimate son of Pepin the Short, who wanted a share in the royal inheritance. The brothers, the legitimate sons, the brothers, they later went on to engage in a brief war with Grifo, and their brother was killed in this war. Now, Charlemagne inherited the core Frankish territories of Austrasia and Nuestria. Carloman was given the fringe territories in southern Francia that had been conquered by Charles Martel, their grandfather, and Pepin the Short. Now, relations between the two brothers broke down, and Charlemagne caught a lucky break in 771 when Carloman died. Now, Carloman had married, and he had fathered young sons of his own, who should have inherited his kingdom. Now, his widow and his children, they fled from Carloman's kingdom in the dead of winter, and they crossed the Alps, and they entered Lombardy. Now, sources favorable to Charlemagne tells us that they did this, and that the Lombards took them in to spite and embarrass Charlemagne. And this is a position particularly taken by Einhard. Now, Charlemagne soon thereafter dismisses his Lombard's wife, and he goes on to annex his brother's kingdom, becoming the king of all Francia at still a very relatively young age. And from a historical analysis, from an historical perspective, it is very doubtful that without securing all the resources of Francia and securing its southern border at the more favorable Pyrenees, it's really doubtful that if Charlemagne hadn't been able to do this very early on in his reign, then he would not have had the career success that he did. In the 770s, Charlemagne began to strike out at his neighbors in every possible direction. First, Charles, he campaigns against the Saxons, living on the eastern banks of the Rhine River. The Continental Saxons were nothing like their British counterparts. They were still pagan at this point. They were still illiterate, and they still were non-urban. They had not adopted urbanism. The Frankish kings had a long history of raiding the Saxon settlements for slaves and for plunder, and Charlemagne, his attacks were not really raids on the Saxon villages. His attacks, it became very clear that his attacks were an effort to conquer the Saxons and to integrate them into his territories and to have them convert to Christianity. These campaigns were long and they were bloody. And beginning in 772, they would last for the better part of his reign. They would not end until 804. Now, Charlemagne's wars with the Saxons were difficult in the sense that in a sense that the Saxons, because they had no urban life and they were so fragmented, it literally required going in and painstakingly defeating literally hundreds of tribes one by one in order to bring the entire region, in order to bring all the people into the fold. If they were urbanized, if they lived in dense urban centers, even just large villages, it would be easy to move in, subdue them, and simply move on. You have the urbanism really just makes the job of the conqueror that much easier, because you have these large, dense populations. When you have these rural populations that are just spread out, you have to painstakingly make every stop, so to speak, en route to conquering these people. Now, Charlemagne, in an effort to ensure that that Christianity took place and that he converted them, he would herd the conquered Saxons into rivers and demand that they accept baptism. This policy is really summed up by convert first, teach later. Now, the Saxons resisted Christianity with gritty tenacity. As soon as the Franks were out of sight, the Saxons would renounce the overlordship of Charlemagne. They would renounce Christianity, and this would prompt Charlemagne to return in the next spring to subdue them once again. And along with subduing them would come another round of forced baptism. In 782, Charlemagne grew frustrated with the Saxons. He grew frustrated with their recalcitrancy, and he had more than 4,000 hanged. And in the end, the Saxons bent to the will of Charlemagne. They accepted his rule, and they accepted Christianity. Centuries later, the Saxons would do to the polytheists living to their east what the Franks had done to them. And this is, of course, an allusion to the Northern Crusades that brought Christianity into the Baltic region, and largely led to the end of the old Prussians, the original inhabitants of what we would call East and West Prussia, around the cities of Kaliningrad, now in Russian, and Gdansk in Polish. In conquering Saxony, Charlemagne conquers a stretch of territory extending from the Rhine to the Elbe River. This accomplishment was a success that had eluded Imperial Rome throughout their run. This is the same region that Caesar Augustus had failed to conquer, and that Marcus Aurelius had failed to conquer. In addition to conquering the Saxons, Charlemagne also campaigned against the Lombards, and the Lombard wars were very swift and very easy as compared to the Saxon wars. And again, that's because the Lombards were living in towns. Now, the Lombards had been transformed from a group of nomadic Germanic barbarians, what they had been when they entered Italy in the 6th century. They had been fully absorbed by the culture, by this Ostrogothic Italic culture. They encountered, and then they became urbanized when they encountered these cities, these great urban centers. They established a permanent capital at Pavia. They were minting gold coins. The capture of their capital, the capture of Pavia, led to the quick collapse of the Kingdom of Lombardy. Einhard reports that Charlemagne had attacked the Lombards for the same reasons that Pepin had attacked the Lombards, to protect papal property, not because the Lombards were sheltering the widow and sons of Charlemagne. which is ostensibly the reason that everyone who reads this sort of gleams that dismissing his Lombard wife and then conquering Lombardy was simply a bit of housekeeping for Charlemagne after the death of Carloman. Now, the Lombard War lasted about a year, and it greatly expanded Charlemagne's empire. He now had possession of north and central Italy. Now, Carloman's family is never heard from after Charlemagne's conquest of Lombardy. The conquest of the Lombard kingdom was a great coup for Charlemagne, who was able to add the title King of the Lombards to his official royal title. Now, the conquest also complicated Charlemagne's life a bit. The Lombards had conquered the territory from the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantines, they wanted it back. Now, Charlemagne refused, and the relationship between the two great powers, the two great Christian powers, sours. Charlemagne also begins to attack Islamic Spain, and his motivation here was again purely opportunistic. The local rulers of Zaragoza, they came to Charlemagne and they requested his assistance against the rulers of Al-Andalus, the Umayyads. Now, in 778, Charlemagne led the Frankish army over the Pyrenees into Spain. His campaign was a disaster. For Charlemagne, as soon as he arrived with his army, the local rulers of Zaragoza, they immediately changed their mind and they refused to allow the Frankish army to enter their city. Rejected, Charlemagne now had to return to Francia without fighting any by now pointless battles. And he nearly makes it home, but he is caught by Christian Basques, who ambushed the rear guard of his army, and the resulting rout was a severe defeat for Charlemagne and his forces. The Basques massacred the Frankish rear guard, and this defeat, but this defeat did not deter Charlemagne or his immediate successors from attempting to make any inroads into Al-Andalus. In 801, his son Louis the Pious goes on and he captures the city of Barcelona. Now, Charlemagne fought many more foes, and his career is literally just the stuff of legends. He built this legendary career for himself, and he mounts these yearly campaigns across Europe. His exploits are so impressive that he is crowned as emperor on Christmas Day in 800 by the Pope. Now, Einhard claims that the coronation was a surprise to Charlemagne, that he was expecting only to attend a mass officiated by the Pope. Einhard said that it was the Pope's idea to crown Charlemagne, and that everybody immediately broke out into imperial acclamations in unison, spontaneously. And this is very doubtful. It is doubtful that Charlemagne did not know about the coronation or the investiture. Charlemagne had a keen interest in the Roman Empire. He also had a very keen interest in Roman emperors, and he often emulated their behaviors. He showcased himself as their equal. Charlemagne Palace in Aachen, or Aix-la-Chapelle. His imperial capital was built to resemble the palace in Constantinople. Charlemagne undoubtedly wanted the imperial title, and he wanted to stand as an equal to the emperors in Constantinople. Now, it is also worth considering the motivations of the Pope, and the Pope at this point was Pope Leo III. The motivations of this Pope to have Charlemagne crowned are very noteworthy. Now, the coronation captivated the imagination of Europe. For nearly 1,000 years, there would be a reigning Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Empire will become a very large geographic designation in Europe, and it will become a permanent designation in Europe for the next 1,000 years. Napoleon I, he apes the coronation in 1804. He tried to tie himself implicitly to the legend of Charlemagne, to the legend, the career, and the successes of Charlemagne. And he also holds the distinction of single-handedly ending Charlemagne's what was then, up until then, a great part of Charlemagne's legacy, the actual Holy Roman Empire. In 1806, he orders it dissolved. Now, back to our narrative. Leo III's motivation for crowning Charlemagne are tied up with local politics. The position of Pope was coveted by the leading families of Rome, and these leading families vied with one another to get their members elected as Pope. When Leo III was elected in 795, the relatives of the previous Pope, Hadrian, were deeply disappointed. They wanted another member of their family to be elected Pope. They accused Leo of being a fornicator and of being a perjurer. When these failed to get him removed to end his rule, to end his papacy, to turn everyone against him, they kidnapped Leo. They kidnapped Leo III. They locked him in a monastery, and they attempted to blind him and to cut out his tongue. They bungled it. Leo escaped, and he fled to Charlemagne's court, and he began to plead his case with the king. This shocking event led Charlemagne to come to Rome and to investigate for himself. Now, Leo was hoping that Charlemagne would come down to Rome and avenge the injustices visited upon him. The charges against Leo III were most likely true. Churchmen, particularly churchmen of this time, they had a history of such activities. They frequently bribed people. They kept mistresses. They fathered illegitimate children. And this would go on for roughly the next 1,000 years as well, with churchmen and popes behaving badly. Charlemagne decided to assist Leo to go to Rome and to avenge him. Carolingian authority was very closely tied to papal authority. The Carolingians had been able to depose the Merovingians and take the title king of the Franks because of papal acquiescence. If the papacy was discredited in any way, there stood a very good chance that the Carolingians would also be discredited as well. Charlemagne traveled to Rome, and he announces that he is going to investigate the charges for himself. He establishes a commission, and this commission examines all the evidence. They interview witnesses, and they tell and it's likely believed that they tell Charlemagne that he wouldn't want to hear the results. The commissioners, they saved themselves by not ruling on the matter. They claim to not have jurisdiction over this case. Now, the evidence is then disposed of, and Charlemagne simply allowed Leo to clear his name with an oath. And Leo swears his oath on the 23rd of December, 800, 2 days before Charlemagne's coronation. There's almost certainly a connection between Leo III's coronation of Charlemagne and Charlemagne's saving and then dismissing of the charges against Leo III. Now, becoming Holy Roman Emperor conferred enormous prestige upon Charlemagne. No actual territory changed hands. In some ways, the coronation saddled the Carolingians with the serious long-term problems. One problem with the implication that the Pope was now superior to the king, since the Pope had crowned Charlemagne emperor. It's also possible that in the future, popes would decide not to crown Carolingians without concessions, raising the specter of future dynastic vulnerability. These conflicts did not occur for a few centuries, but there were signs that during the remainder of Charlemagne's reign, his position was somewhat weakened because of the acceptance of the imperial office, of the imperial dignity. Charlemagne made a final will and testament, this will and this final will and testament provided for the division of his territories among his sons. Under the arrangement of 1806, none of his sons were to receive the imperial title. Instead, they would reign as kings. The imperial title would go out with Charlemagne, and we get a sense that he regards the title of emperor as a personal honorific rather than had a permanent political office or a permanent hereditary title. By the time Charlemagne was dying in 1813, he had lost nearly all of his sons except for Louis the Pious, who was by now the great heir to all of Charlemagne's territories. Now, Charlemagne decides, as he's dying and he only has one son to succeed him, he decides to he decides that Louis should not just succeed to the Carolingian domains, the full Carolingian domain, but he should also succeed to the imperial title. So he has him crowned as co-emperor in 1813. And in this ceremony, Charlemagne crowns Louis emperor himself. Now, this is an attempt to wrest away, this is an attempt by Charlemagne to wrest away the imperial investiture from the papacy, reserving that right for the Carolingian dynasty, the Carolingian emperors themselves, to formally illustrate, to formally declare their heir apparent their heir. Their heir for the imperial dignity, the imperial office. Now, it was unclear whether Charlemagne had the jurisdiction to do so. In 1816, Louis XVI is crowned again, but this time he's crowned by Leo III, that our same pope who was perceived by the problems that Charlemagne aided him in, and the same pope that crowned Charlemagne. From this point on, from 1816 on, it is clear that the Pope, and that the Pope alone, the Bishop of Rome, had the power to crown an emperor. As Charlemagne aged, he slowed. He was no longer able to campaign the way he had in his youth. His health began to turn. As a result, he spent more and more of his time at his imperial capital, his palace, Aachen. In 1804, after there are, as a matter of fact, in 1804, after 1804, there are no more great campaigns during the reign of Charlemagne. The Frankish Empire does not expand any further, and worse, the Frankish Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire, I should say, go to war with each other over the failure of the Frankish kings of Charlemagne to return Lombardy and his elevation to emperor, to the title and style of emperor. The wars fought between the Franks and the Romans between 803 and 812 accomplished nothing. To make things worse for the Carolingians, the Norsemen, the Norse, they began to attack the Carolingian Empire. Charlemagne, he's best remembered because he assumed the imperial title, for extending the boundaries of Francia. He had a genuine interest in scholarship and religion. As such, he became an important supporter of ecclesiastic reforms and scholarship. Now, Charlemagne and his dynasty, the Carolingian dynasty, in addition to presiding over the declaration or the creation of the Holy Roman Empire, in addition to serving as the first Holy Roman emperors, they also presided over a Renaissance in Western Europe. Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, they recruited scholars throughout Europe to restore the Latin language to its original purity. These scholars were also tasked with restoring or producing clean copies of sacred Christian texts. They began the process of removing the errors that had been made in copies of the Bible and of the Rule of Saint Benedict. The Carolingian scholars, they created a system and a style of writing that largely led to the prevention of such mistakes. and largely served to keep such mistakes from creeping back in to Christian theological texts and important civic documents. Their achievements include distinguishing between upper and lowercase letters, using punctuation, and putting spaces in between words. These are some of the linguistic or the literary renaissance or innovations of the Carolingian kings. Now, the Carolingians, as stated a little earlier, they faced many problems during their reign, but none was more threatening than the Viking raids than the attack by the Norsemen. And the word Viking itself comes from an Old Norse word, Vikingur, and it only the term and the word only applied to seaborne raiders. Not everyone in Scandinavia bore the title or could be accurately described as a Viking. We know that Scandinavians refer to the Vikings as such, but we are at a loss for what the word originally meant. Now, the target for their assaults called them Vikings, but also the term pagan was used because the Scandinavians still worshipped the old Germanic gods of Woden and Thor and Tyr and Frigga. And all the other ones. They still worship those old Germanic gods. They were called Northmen as well because they came from the north. These were Scandinavian Jutes, these were Danes, these were Norsemen, Norwegians, these were Swedes, and they spoke a related languages. They spoke related languages, and really the language grouping and the language family, the umbrella, really borders on them speaking one language, but really just regional dialects of one language. So rather than saying that rather than saying that they had different languages, that they had the same language, they just spoke regional variants, dialects of it. We know from archaeological and a few written records that the Scandinavians played an important role in a trade route known as the Northern Arc. Now, the Northern Arc linked the British Isles, the North and the Baltic Sea, along with the Amber Road, and then traveled through Eastern Europe all the way down to Constantinople and the Islamic world centered on Baghdad. Now, the Scandinavians formed the linchpin or the backbone of the trade route. And we have found some very remarkable finds in Scandinavia. These include a golden Buddha statue, thousands of Arab silver coins, and other prestige goods coming from the Roman Empire and from the Abbasid Caliphate. And it's at this point that we will break and we'll come back and we will continue up with our examination of Scandinavian society and really the Viking Age. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, and I'll see you guys next time.